We've been talking a lot in this class in different ways about metamorphosis, if only by reading about changing, changing yourself, and changing your conception of the world you belong to, whether, family or society, the social systems you participate in and thereby perpetuate. The, so thinking about yourself not just as an identity isolated, but thinking about yourself in terms of the systems of social reproduction that you participate in. This is Nietzsche describes a sort of fable of history in terms of metamorphosis. The camel, we become a camel at first through our capacity to bear burdens, fulfill our duties. So the next stage of metamorphosis is a lion, this apex predator who decides for itself what to do, takes dictation from no one, takes orders from no one. So even beyond the lion, the next stage, the ultimate metamorphosis, is the human child. What can the child do which even the lion could not do? Why hath the preying lion still to become a child? Innocence is the child, and forgetfulness, a new beginning, a game, a self-rolling wheel, a first movement, a holy yea, holy yes. Inventing new purposes, new values, a wheel rolling out of itself. We create our own histories. We decide what we assert ourselves for. It's not just asserting superior power, it's changing what power even means in the first place. That's the innocence, the radical creativity of the child's innocent playfulness. This is what Butler is most interested in, is creating our own history, creating ourselves by creating our own history, the wheel rolling out of oneself as a reproductive system of oneself. What I am is about asserting a certain set of reproductive values. I see this right from the beginning of Bloodchild. The distribution of the eggs among the family, explaining the event with which the story opens, is a matter of understanding a whole complex and rather deeply disturbing system of reproduction. There are a lot of images in the story of violence that we're asked to read as images of love. Think of Tagore licking the blood away from Lomas. Tagore seemed to pay no attention as she lengthened and deepened the cut, now and then pausing to lick away blood. His blood vessels contracted, reacting to the chemistry of her saliva, and the bleeding slowed. It's an odd sentence there, because it's like, from whose perspective is this getting reported? Presumably the narrator can't see the blood vessels contracting. This sounds like a piece of information that the narrator has learned in the course of his education. The diagrams and drawings that Tagore had shown me, I knew how it worked. It had been explained to me all my life. Making the blood vessels contract by licking away the blood is a systemic feature of reproduction that the narrator Gon has been instructed about, presumably told, why it's good, the same way in which we might be told the birds and the bees as kids were instructed in why it makes sense and why it's good and wholesome and purposeful and so on. But evidently here he's not able to internalize it. His whole being revolts at the spectacle of this so-called birth. He doesn't know why he hasn't vomited. He feels like he's participating in a torture. And we're also It's also interesting features of this system of reproduction. We learned this idea of the preserve, that humans exist in this preserve, and Gatoy is sort of a representative of the government, preserving the humans from the to click off the preserve. It's because they're on the preserve that Kui has insight before Gon in this scene. Kui was already familiar with the violence of the T'Klik and tried to run away. And he realizes the preserve is actually not just a preserve, but also a cage. So this is, as Octavia Butler says, this is a coming of age story in a certain way, and all coming of age stories have to do with recognizing hard realities that we're shielded from in childhood, right? Recognizing, the scary realities of death and sexuality and the, cruel, indifferent randomness of the world. So that's what Gon is waking up to hear as well. Because don't we too rely on promises of fidelity, promises of family? Just like here, the story ends with, I'll always take care of you. I do consider you family. What does that mean, though? That's just a promise. Family is nothing more than the faith that we bring to family. And, we've seen this in so many different examples. The narrator ends up volunteering to experience the horror that he couldn't bear witnessing. Don't do it to my sister, do it to me. Because, Gon seems to reason, it would be easier to know that red worms were growing in my flesh instead of hers. So, once again, as in Frankenstein, horror becomes the test of intimacy, of bonding. We bonding over the prospect of horror. That's what really holds us together. And Gon, in a way, that turns the tables a little bit on Gatoy, insisting on maintaining the rifle. If we're not your animals, if we are family, and if we're talking about these adult realities of family, then you have to accept the risk too. There is risk, Gatoy, in dealing with any partner. I think that's fascinating idea here in this story, which, like Frankenstein, it's horrific, but finally it's about you. It's about the horror that the story forces you to feel, that tells you about yourself. It's an interesting line here. Rather ironic use of the term grace to describe something not graceful at all. It's an interesting sort of refinement of the horror, this incipient horror. It's not there yet, but that kind of makes it all the more horrifying. Butler is very precise about describing the horror, the horrific object. It was worse than finding something dead, rotting, and filled with tiny animal grubs, and it was far worse than any drawing or diagram. So it's a specific horror of infested live flesh, not infested dead flesh. And she's specific about the horror insofar as she's saying, this is what the drawing or diagram left out. I'd been told about this all my life, but this is what the analytical explanations left out. Is interesting to think about, okay, so what's different from the diagram drawn by this text? I mean, this text is what we're getting here is a codified schematization of some kind. That's what text is. Butler's bringing up the question of, again, diagramming, codifying, and what it leaves out. How is it that she's able to bring it back in? And this line makes me think of pregnancy. It makes me think of morning sickness in relationship to birth. Sort of an illness that serves also as a kind of preparation of the body for transformation. I think this question of being in a body that has kind of a mind of its own, in a way, is what interests Butler about disease and genetics. That so much of our behavior can be, retraced to genetic factors of some kind or another. Butler's short story, The Evening, the Morning, and the Night. It's also about being in a body with a kind of life cycle of its own. Butler asks, if 1 in 50,000 genes can have such a devastating impact on a life, like what aren't all the rest of them doing in terms of the impact on your life? So much of the behavior described by the narrator we learn it eventually is totally out of her control. She thinks she's just one member of this group of people living together, but she's actually what allows them to live together because she has this specific gene. And then she's attracted to this guy and learns that's exactly, and he's attracted to her. And she has a negative reaction to Beatrice, that we also learn is mutual and genetically dictated. And the story ends with her sort of in the midst of a rage, at Beatrice, even as they're seem to be kind of consolidating their relationship, interestingly, by phone, which will allow them to not get aggravated by each other. So it's another interesting sort of technological adjunct to biology. But she's nonetheless in the midst of a rage and disgust against Beatrice. All I could do was scramble into the car and floor my own phantom accelerator as the guard drove us to the gate. I couldn't look back at her. Until we were well away from the house, until we'd left the guard at the gate and gone off the property, I couldn't make myself look back. For long, irrational minutes, I was convinced that somehow, if I turned, I would see myself standing there, gray and old, growing small in the distance, vanishing. That's a very haunting image because we really don't know if this insight into herself, this horrifying picture of herself, makes any difference. It's, because with this is a story about figuring out these kind of patterns or proclivities of behavior. And one of them is this rage that she's experiencing as the story ends, although on the level of the narrative it seems like she's found an insight into herself and a connection and understanding, and a beautiful picture of, I think, the possibility of sympathetic imagination. Naomi's clay statues, the intricacy of these figures designed by a self-mutilated blind woman. So, real testimony to the possibility of an imagined community, at least. The narrator here really doesn't. It's revolted by the prospect of having her life determined by this disease. Or could this be read as anyone's experience of sort of fear of facing mortality, one's own gray old age and death, vanishing? An image very much like the end of Frankenstein. So, where does this story leave our sense of free will in family? It takes a daily cycle evening, morning, night. Um, for its title, what does that mean? If it's part of this cycle, daily cycle, does that mean it's also part of a recurring rhythm? Is this the end? What does it mean for the narrator here to go forward? You know, she's kind of been asking herself not what she's living for, but why she hasn't killed herself. So has that been clarified at all? How do we read that?